Before we start, if you're enjoying these conversations, please make sure that you like or subscribe to Cleaning Up. It really helps other people to find us. Cleaning Up is brought to you by the Liebreich Foundation and the Gilardini Foundation. Hello, I'm Michael Liebreich and this is Cleaning Up. This week's episode is a special program on resilience. As I record it, President Putin's barbaric and unjustified invasion of Ukraine enters its 6th week and is showing every indication of lasting much longer. The last piece I wrote for BloombergNEF before it began was entitled Resilience: What Could Possibly Go Wrong? Over the past few years, as the world finally started to show real determination to deal with climate change, I've become increasingly concerned that it was pursuing net zero at the expense of affordability and security. There is no such thing as a just transition if it requires that energy prices be driven up for poor and vulnerable people, and there will be no transition at all if it compromises energy security. My piece for BloombergNEF was intended to sound a cautionary note and jumpstart a public debate. Like most people, I was not predicting that Vladimir Putin would invade Ukraine. I was just making the point in the best way I could that in centering concern about resilience on the impacts of climate change, we were shortchanging a number of other existential risks. Nothing, however, could have made my point more strongly than Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Already, the issue of security has soared from 3rd or 4th priority in national energy policies right to the top. The Ukraine war will not only mark a turning point in geopolitics and security, it will also mark a turning point in the history of the energy industry and the net zero transition. I'll come back to this topic and provide a few thoughts on the war in Ukraine at the end of this episode. Meanwhile, however, with thanks as ever to BloombergNEF for letting me use it, here is the audio version of my February 2022 piece, Resilience: What Could Possibly Go Wrong? The word resilience has become increasingly fashionable in climate circles. Last month, the IPCC published the second part of its 6th assessment report, AR6, focusing on climate impacts, vulnerabilities and adaptation. The idea of climate resilience featured prominently. But what does resilience mean in practice? What are the risks against which we need to protect ourselves? What does being resilient entail? How much public or private money should be spent? Are there trade-offs between resilience to climate and other types of risks? At the beginning of this year, the World Economic Forum's Global Risks Report identified the top 3 of what it called the most severe risks on a global scale over the next 10 years to be biodiversity loss, extreme weather, and in top place, climate action failure. Seriously? It's not just that Russia was at the time massing troops to invade Ukraine. The US and its allies appeared to be on a path to confront an increasingly authoritarian China, and the worst pandemic for a century was still taking a grisly toll on people and the economy. Any one of these threats clearly presented a more severe global risk than climate change over the next decade. It's probably worth noting that previous editions of the Global Risks Report failed to warn of the 2008-9 Great Financial Crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic. Activist climate scientist Professor Michael Mann may claim, as he did on a recent television appearance, that wildfires, droughts, floods, heat waves, coastal inundation, climate change is already costing far more lives than COVID-19, but he's wrong, and he's wrong by at least 2 orders of magnitude. The confirmed death toll from COVID so far is 5.8 million, and the best estimate of the actual total, including deaths before testing was in place globally, is nearly 20 million. Weather-related deaths, by contrast, have averaged 18,500 a year for the past decade, each one a tragedy, but down by around 95% over the past century. Once you normalise for increased global wealth over time, there's even a clear downward trend in economic damages from climate-related disasters. Now, before you jump all over me, I'm not saying we should not be acting on climate change. Far from it. Last year's 6th assessment report of the IPCC was perfectly clear, confirming as an established fact that climate change is already increasing the frequency and violence of extreme weather, and things will only get worse without adequate investment in both mitigation and adaptation. Longer term, while we may no longer be tracking the disaster scenarios that drive the rhetoric of Greta Thunberg and Extinction Rebellion, we are far from the 1.5 degrees centigrade warming goal that guarantees stability of the climate for the long term, or even the less safe 2 degrees centigrade. What I am saying is that those who seek to recruit the concept of resilience purely in support of climate action are shortchanging other and potentially more catastrophic near-term risks. In addition, in our haste to transition to net zero, we may even be rendering our energy and transport systems more fragile rather than more robust. This discussion is playing out in the early stages of a complete transformation of our energy, transport, industrial and infrastructure systems. So let's start by taking a look at what it is we're building. The electricity system embarked on the transition a couple of decades ago. The old system of baseload and peak, with a relatively small number of large generators connected to a transmission grid, is being replaced by one with enormous numbers of smaller generators connected at all points from the centre to the grid edge. Significant proportions of supply and demand will vary at will, with balancing provided by demand response, storage, whether that's power storage, thermal storage or chemical storage, overcapacity and interconnections with neighbouring systems. Transport, next out of the blocks, is going electric. Not just urban transport and not just cars, but all of it, with the exception of aviation, deep sea shipping and perhaps long-distance freight. Electric vehicle chargers will end up as ubiquitous as Wi-Fi. The shockwaves, as BloombergNEF's then chief editor and Angus McCrone and I wrote in 2016, will cascade through every sector of the economy, from insurance to dealer networks and from city layouts to finance ministries. Clean hydrogen will be essential for the decarbonisation, but that will be the decarbonisation of fertiliser, plastics and chemicals, as well as perhaps steel and long-duration storage, demanding the development of an entire new distribution and storage system. There may or may not be a substantial e-fuels sector, and as I explained in part 2 of my podcast and accompanying blog for BloombergNEF, Separating Hype from Hydrogen in October 2020, the bulk of domestic, commercial and industrial heating will be electric. So we're talking about a massive increase in electrification. Over the last half century, electricity went from delivering just 10% of final energy to just over 20%. Over the next half century, we will see a far more dramatic increase. There is no version of a net zero economy in which electrification will serve less than 60% of final energy. In addition to being vastly more deeply electrified, the system will be vastly more efficient, and it will need to be managed and optimized in real time. And this means 100% digitization, pervasive sensors, low latency communications, big data, machine learning, distributed ledger accounting, digital twins, and so on. So this is the future we're headed for. Now, a decade or so ago, it was fashionable to talk about the energy trilemma, the need for energy to be simultaneously affordable, clean, and secure. The term fell into misuse as the cost of wind, solar, and lithium-ion batteries plummeted. As the future of limitless, clean, affordable energy hove into view, the security aspect faded into the background. I was as guilty as any. In my BloombergNEF summit keynote in 2015, I described the new age of plenty: cheap oil, cheap gas, cheap renewables, cheap energy efficiency, but I didn't talk about resilience. Some argue that the new system will be inherently more resilient because it will be less dependent on a small number of large suppliers. Decarbonized, decentralized, democratized, runs the mantra. It's wishful thinking. It may be relatively easy to design a cheap wind and solar-based system that meets power needs for much of the year, but it is orders of magnitude harder to design one that can get through monsoon and rainy seasons, winter weeks with low wind and freezing weather in northern climes, or shocks of an unprecedented scale. The new German government has announced its intention to shut the country's final 3 nuclear power stations at the end of 2022 and all of its coal-fired power stations by 2030, while at the same time reducing the country's CO2 emissions by 65%, effectively ruling out any increased dependence on gas. So what is their plan to keep the lights on? Germany's wind and solar resources are counter-correlated, with more wind in winter and more sun in summer. However, research shows that around once per year there is a shortfall period of 5 days or more when their combined output falls to less than 15% of average. Batteries are not going to fill these periods, called Dunkelflaute or dark doldrums. Even under the most optimistic views on experience curves and raw material availability, batteries big enough to power the country for 5 days, but used just once a year, would be prohibitively expensive. Inevitably, therefore, Germany is going to become even more dependent on its neighbours than it is today. Setting aside the fact that its largest energy supplier is currently invading Ukraine, there are 2 problems. First, it is impossible to be sure that your neighbours will have excess power, or hydrogen perhaps, just when you need it, particularly in the light of their own transitions. And second, even your most friendly neighbour today may not be quite as friendly tomorrow. During the early stages of the pandemic, we saw ugly outbreaks of PPE and vaccine nationalism. Which country will export power if its old people are dying of hypothermia? In the US, coal's share of power generation fell from 33% to 19% between 2015 and 2020. Great news from a climate perspective, not so much from a resilience perspective. In 2015, the country held enough stocks of thermal coal to meet its entire power needs for 31 days. By 2021, the figure was down to 17 days. Meanwhile, over the same period, natural gas rose from providing 32% of US electricity to 40%, but didn't provide any increase in storage. Wind and solar's contribution grew from 5% to 10%, also without providing an iota of additional storage. This can only mean that the US's power system has become less resilient to supply shocks, which last for more than a few weeks. The point is not that piles of coal at power stations are the only way to provide resilience, as President Trump's first Secretary of Energy, Rick Perry, tried to claim in 2017. The point is that if you remove safety margins in one place without adding any elsewhere in the system, don't be surprised if your chickens one day come home to roost. Now, I know there are plenty of energy modelers out there who will point to their models and claim that there's no problem. Frankly, they remind me of the financial analysts in the run-up to the great financial crisis, who used their huge computers to analyse historic trends every which way and find profits, but were blind to fat tail risks that were not in their datasets. If we learn just one thing from history, it should be that black swans happen. In Asia, many national grids are insufficiently robust to allow particularly deep penetration of renewables, be that internally within Japan, China and India, or between many smaller countries and archipelago nations. China has for years been promoting the Global Energy Interconnection Development and Cooperation Organization, GuideCo, using high-voltage DC technology to even out variability in renewable resources, from the Arctic to the tropics, from Europe to East Asia. But would Japan, or for that matter any other major Asian nation, be wise to become dependent on China for power? In Africa, we all celebrate the growth of solar rooftops and the building of wind and solar plants, myself as much as anyone. In the G20, for the next few decades, it is of course natural gas that will keep the lights on when there's no wind or sun. The EU has even included natural gas in its green taxonomy. Africa, however, is being denied the funds to develop its natural gas resources. As a result, Africa risks being rendered permanently uncompetitive by an unreliable power system. Shutting down investment in fossil fuels before you have a plan to replace their role in the energy system is neither resilient nor just. There are no easy answers. If you think nuclear power holds the only hope for a truly robust system, setting aside the obvious risks of proliferation, accidents, and the lack of long-term waste storage, nuclear faces its own very specific catch-22. To have any chance of achieving economic competitiveness, dozens or even hundreds of identical plants need to be built. But each time one experiences a safety scare, the risk is that all will need to be shut down. Unlikely, perhaps? No. Recently, 10% of France's nuclear output was taken offline when cracked pipelines were detected in multiple plants. And it turns out even swarms of jellyfish can shut nuclear plants. They've done so on multiple occasions worldwide. Nor is the push by nations to achieve energy independence a resilient strategy. Energy commodities are traded globally, and shocks are transmitted by markets. Fracking in the UK, for instance, will do little or nothing to protect consumers from price spikes. The chance of extracting enough gas to significantly move European prices is near to zero. Nor is relying on imported LNG a resilient strategy. You cannot be sure there will not be times when it's unavailable or extortionately expensive. Now let's look at what happens when things go wrong. Power cuts today can be catastrophic. Last year's Texas outages left 4.5 million people without heating, water and power for days and were responsible for between 250 and 700 deaths. Sick babies in need of oxygen and warmth start to die 20 minutes from the beginning of one of the frequent power cuts across the developing world. But future power cuts may be even worse. We're building a system of systems: power, transport, telecommunications, health services, logistics, payments, emergency services, public information, all dependent on each other with tight linkages and no circuit breakers. How do you protect the energy system from looting if you can't charge the vehicles of your first responders? How do you procure spare parts for power plants if the payment system fails? With great power come great power cuts. Studies of complex systems provide a theoretical basis for concern. It is possible to model systems that are stable, but which, as you extend them and link them to other stable systems, reach a bifurcation point where they become unstable. Cascading voltage collapses have been behind a number of continent-scale power outages. This is the dark underside of interconnecting power systems over wider and wider areas to deal with renewables variability. In January last year, a fault in a Croatian substation came close to taking down the entire European electrical system from the west of Portugal to the east of Turkey. To make things worse, as we've just seen from the pandemic, there is hysteresis in crisis. In other words, things don't just bounce back to the way they were. In 2011, Germany's Office of Technology Assessment published a report on what would happen in the event of a prolonged power outage. Within a few days, the country's communications, including those used by the emergency services, would fail. Rail and air transport can't run without electricity, neither can the road system without signalling and emergency services. Ports would grind to a halt. Fuel quickly becomes unavailable. Fresh water and sewage stop flowing. Without refrigeration or transport, farming, food processing, and food distribution all stop. Healthcare and financial payments are next. Military and civil emergency services swing into action, but what can they do without transport or communications? Civil disorder breaks out as people starve and, if it's winter, freeze. The authors of the report conclude it would be almost impossible to prevent a collapse of society as a whole. And this is Germany, not a fragile developing country. And then there's the cyber threat. Countries are no longer at peace until they're at war. Today, they maintain a persistent state of cyber hostility against their rivals, which they dial up or down in line with international events. In 2007, Estonia was the first ever victim of a concerted cyber attack from entities based in Russia. The Baltic Republic's cyber defences are now constantly being probed. In the 2020 SolarWinds hack, attackers affiliated with the Russian state were found to have penetrated multiple US government websites and up to 18,000 corporations. In January this year, Russia hacked 70 Ukrainian government websites in preparation for its onslaught. Infrastructure presents a particularly juicy attack surface. In a 2019 survey by German engineering powerhouse Siemens, 56% of utility company IT executives reported that cyber breaches were responsible for at least one incident per year, causing outages, damage, injury, and even environmental disaster. Last year, one such attack took down the Colonial Pipeline in the US. What began with a ransomware attack on the company's payment system led to a 5-day shutdown. Fuel deliveries were disrupted, which in turn triggered panic buying and then real fuel shortages. Last month, the same thing happened to German fuel distributor Mabanaft. Panic buying is one of the biggest non-linear vulnerabilities of our connected world. In the UK last September, the mere rumour of fuel shortages led to lines of cars at forecourts until fuel supplies actually ran out. A month later, stocks were back to normal. Are you worried yet? You really should be. But we're not done yet. Nature still has some surprises up her sleeve. Meteor and comet impacts are enjoying a moment in the public gaze due to the success of the Netflix climate spoof Don't Look Up. The reality, however, is that NASA judges the probability of a city-killing impact on the scale of the 1908 Tunguska event at less than 0.1% per year. That of an extinction event is once in 100 million years and practically ruled out before 2175. A far more concerning threat is posed by solar storms. On the 1st and 2nd of September 1859, the most intense solar event in recorded history hit the planet in what is known as the Carrington event. Northern lights were visible as far south as Colombia and southern Japan. This was 20 years before Thomas Edison had created the world's first electric utility, but the telegraph system was knocked out. Operators reported electric shocks from their equipment. Pylons threw sparks, and messages could be sent and received without generators being connected. Solar storms less severe than the Carrington event hit the Earth in 1921 and 1960. In 1989, a geomagnetic storm knocked out power in Quebec. In 2012, a storm of a similar power as the Carrington event missed Earth by a few degrees. It's not a question of whether this sort of storm will hit us in the future, but when. One scientific estimate puts the likelihood at just over 1% per year, with the danger peaking at solar cycle maxima. The next one of those, since you ask, occurs in 2025. If a Carrington-level solar storm were to hit Earth today, it would knock out satellites, radio and electrical equipment, and create powerful currents in conductors such as railway tracks, pipelines, and of course cables. It would fry transformers, switchgear, and connected appliances. No GPS system, no electrical system, no communications, probably for months, and with less than a day's notice. In a 2013 report, Lloyd's of London estimated the potential damage at somewhere between 0.6 and $2.6 trillion. That's trillion with a T, and even that feels like an underestimate. Most developed countries, of course, have contingency plans. The UK's 2015 Space Weather Preparedness Strategy, the US Department of Homeland Security's Strategy for Protecting and Preparing the Homeland Against Threats of Electromagnetic Pulse and Geomagnetic Disturbances, and so on. However, if the pandemic taught us anything, it is that those who think they're well prepared often aren't. So what's to do? First, if we're serious about resilience, we need to identify the risks we actually face, not just focus on ones in the political or civil society spotlight. Next, we need to plan infrastructure and systems that can withstand the shocks identified. There's an extensive literature on how to do this, much of it structured around the 4 principles first described by the US National Infrastructure Advisory Council in 2010, which the UK government has borrowed and restated as the 4 R's of resilience: resistance, reliability, redundancy, and recovery. Resistance means assets must be designed to withstand the forces and disruptions they're likely to encounter. In the context of climate change, anything we build needs to take into account higher sea levels, higher temperatures, more violent storms, more frequent droughts and wildfires, and the like. In some cases, this will also prepare our infrastructure to face non-climate related risks, but that must not be assumed to be the case. Reliability means that assets must be able to operate within a wide range of conditions and not degrade over time. The power grid needs to continue to serve the bulk of demand, and certainly critical demand, even in the events that parts of it fail, or in the event of failures in other related systems. We need to be building a grid which, like the internet, cannot be brought down in its totality under any circumstances. We also need to invest dramatically more in the maintenance of our aging infrastructure. This is a huge resilience issue with or without climate change. The importance of redundancy cannot be overstated, as we saw when global supply chains were disrupted for months by one single ship stuck in the Suez Canal. In a world governed exclusively by profit motives, redundancy is often squeezed out of the system, and regulators may need to step in. As I first said at my 2014 BloombergNEF Summit keynote, overcapacity is a feature of the future energy system, not a bug. And finally, recovery. That governs the ability of the system to adapt after it's challenged, either in real time, as when power utilities seamlessly shifted output from offices to homes during the pandemic, or by learning and adapting after incidents. Finally, if we want resilience, we're going to have to pay for it. And as New Zealand's leading futurist Roger Dennis put it in the context of the pandemic, resilience is expensive in the short term, but cheap in the long term. The stakes are high. The IPCC report this year on adaptation rightly points out that climate change is a source of near-term risk. But we must bear in mind that it is only one source among many. We need to do clear-headed analysis, roll up our sleeves, get our checkbooks out, and start building. Now, as I promised at the start of this episode, I want to finish with a few thoughts about the implications of Russia's invasion of Ukraine for the energy system and the net zero transition. Like anyone, my thoughts are first and foremost with the Ukrainian people who've done nothing to deserve the catastrophe being visited on them and on their country. I'm also thinking of the increasing numbers of ordinary Russians who do not support the war. They too are going to suffer enormously through no fault of their own. May they find it in themselves to act with the bravery shown until now by the Ukrainian people. And let's turn to energy. First of all, to those who are saying that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is the wake-up call that will finally get the UK to reduce its dependence on Russian gas, don't be so sure. In 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea, the European Council asked the European Commission to develop a plan to diversify energy sources away from Russia. 8 years later, despite continuous conflict, interrupted by no fewer than 29 failed ceasefires, Europe is more dependent than ever on Russian gas and coal, and still a major buyer of Russian oil. Those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Germany, rather than diversifying the source of its gas away from Russia, instead tried to diversify its route, investing huge financial and diplomatic capital in pushing through Nord Stream 2 to bypass Ukraine. Early on in the war, sanctions were placed on Russian oligarchs who benefited handsomely from their relationships with Putin. For some reason, however, SDP ex-Chancellor of Germany Gerhard Schröder has not yet been added to the list. Yet no friend of Putin's has worked more assiduously or for as long to turn Germany into a Russian dependency. In 2006, within days of leaving office, he became chair of Nord Stream. He's now a board member of Rosneft and has just been nominated to the board of Gazprom. As soon as Russia invaded Ukraine in March this year, Nord Stream 2 was dead, or if not dead, then certainly resting until Vladimir Putin is out of office in Moscow. Incredibly, though, despite what the EU's High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, Josep Borrell, describes as the harshest package of sanctions we've ever implemented, Russian gas is still being delivered to customers in Western Europe via pipelines through Ukraine. Russia continues to earn money every day from sales of oil and gas, money it is able to receive via those banks still connected to the SWIFT system, and which it can use to sustain its war effort. The International Energy Agency has produced plans to reduce imports of Russian oil and gas by over a third and perhaps as much as a half within a year. But if we really want to help Ukraine in its hour of need, we need to move more quickly. We need to stop this blood-soaked trade entirely and do so before next winter. Oil mainly enters Europe by tanker, so it can be sourced globally, and getting off Russian supplies is just a matter of price. Getting off Russian gas, however, which arrives by pipeline, is much harder. We are limited in our ability to import gas from other sources in the near term by our infrastructure. We could do it if we had to, but we cannot do it without soaring energy costs, without shutting down large parts of European industry, and above all, without consumers noticing, which is presumably why our leaders are not seriously discussing it. What they're doing instead is focusing the discussion around long-term options, things like more renewable power, heat pumps, EVs, biogas, hydrogen, small modular nuclear plants, even fracking. And let's be clear, for as long as we need gas, there's nothing uniquely bad about fracking. In the end, these things will help neutralise fossil fuel dictators of all stripes, and they're also consistent with net zero by 2050. But let's be honest, they don't form a basis for a near-term solution to the current crisis. They are being promoted not because they help Ukraine, but because they appeal to the usual constituents and agendas. If the homework question, on the other hand, is to be off Russian gas by next winter, our options are limited, and we have to be prepared to take some financial and social pain. First of all, as the IEA pointed out, we should be looking to increase the import of gas from other locations to the greatest extent possible, whether by pipeline from Azerbaijan and Norway or via the LNG markets. Europe has limited capacity to import LNG, but if our allies in Asia and Latin America can be persuaded to help out, there are floating storage and regasification units, or FSRUs, that could perhaps be redeployed to Europe and connected to our gas network. Secondly, the bulk of natural gas is used in heating of one sort or another. Reducing demand is almost always framed in terms of sacrificing comfort. Turn down the thermostat and wear a sweater. There are, however, a host of other things we can do which would have meaningful impact on demand without affecting comfort. For instance, for the past 16 years, we have, by law in the UK, only been installing condensing boilers, but most are set on the manufacturer's recommendation at flow temperatures so high that they don't condense, wasting huge amounts of gas. We fail to maintain our gas-powered industrial equipment. We're heating offices, which, since the pandemic, are being used only 3 or 4 days a week. Wasting gas on a heroic scale is not just helping Vladimir Putin, it is costing households and businesses billions of pounds, dollars and euros, and contributing unnecessarily to climate change. Third, we could impose a temporary halt to gas-intensive industries like fertilizer manufacture and oil refining, which would be preferable to letting high natural gas prices drive them to bankruptcy, which looks like it might happen anyway. For a few years, we could import all the relevant finished commodities from gas-rich Australia, Latin America, the US, Canada, and the Gulf, husbanding precious gas import capacity to keep the lights on and people warm. Germany could follow Belgium's example and announce that it was going to keep its last 3 nuclear power stations operating. Shortly after the Russian invasion of Ukraine began, the Green Vice-Chancellor Robert Habeck announced that he had reviewed the closure, but it was too late to avert it because of concerns over safety and fuel availability. Sorry, that's the wrong answer. Try again. Even if those power stations have to be offline for a year, something I'm pretty sure could be avoided if it were really critical, that is better than losing their contribution to security and climate action forever. What else could we do before next winter? Well, we could use those decorative log burners and biomass stoves. I'm more than aware of the air pollution problems they cause, but if it's a choice between hypothermia, funneling money to Mr. Putin, and poor air quality, which is the morally correct choice? And yes, for a couple of years, we could fire up every coal-fired power station in Europe that has not been dismantled, if that was what it takes to starve Mr. Putin of funds and bring the conflict to an end. You don't want to do that because of the short-term bump in emissions? Well, perhaps you would like to volunteer to be the one to tell the people besieged in Mariupol. And finally, whichever way this conflict ends, as soon as it's over, this time we need to learn the lessons. If this ghastly war is to have any silver lining at all, it must be that in the longer term the needs of energy security should be seen to be served by, and not in opposition to, the net zero transition. The single most appropriate memorial that we could ever build for the victims of the Russian invasion of Ukraine would be an affordable, zero-emission, and above all, resilient energy system. Thank you for listening. That brings to an end this special episode on resilience and the war in Ukraine. My guest next week on Cleaning Up will be Claire Skinner, Regional Managing Partner for Europe and Africa at Heidrick & Struggles, and one of the foremost experts in the world on recruiting executive talent for the net zero transition. Please join me at this time next week for another episode of Cleaning Up. Cleaning Up is brought to you by the Liebreich Foundation and the Gilardini Foundation.